They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Hello. This is Making Sense of History, where we find out about the present by running the clock back to see where it all started. I'm Nick Eckstein, from the History Department at the University of Sydney, talking to you today from Wurundjeri land. You are listening to The Last Post, the call with which Commonwealth forces commemorate soldiers who die in war. Before that, you heard lines from the Ode of Remembrance, taken from a poem entitled For the Fallen by English poet Lawrence Binyon, who was reacting to reports of monstrous carnage filtering back from France to England in September of 1914, just 7 weeks after the outbreak of war. Every year on Anzac Day, April the 25th, the Ode is read aloud to thousands of Australians at countless dawn services all over Australia and at Gallipoli itself. The Ode is followed by the Last Post, after which the officer who has recited the Ode then utters the 3 most resonant words of the entire service. They are an invocation to remember, and they are a warning.
Lest we forget.
Welcome to Episode 3, the final part of our series of podcast discussions, Making Sense of Anzac. I'm back talking once again with my friend and colleague, Brad Manera. If you've listened to parts 1 and 2, you'll already know that Brad is Senior Historian and Museum Curator at the Anzac Memorial at Hyde Park in Sydney, and an honorary affiliate in the History Department at the University of Sydney. He's also a historian with a special interest in the social context of war and the effects of military conflict on society at large. In Episode 1, he and I discussed the Gallipoli campaign itself and some of its effects on Australian culture. In Episode 2, we talked about the often ignored involvement of women and some of the ways in which the Anzac tradition evolved over the course of the 20th century. If you missed Episodes 1 and 2, I invite you to go back and listen to them first before continuing. Today, in our final discussion, Brad and I discussed the impulse that almost since the moment hostilities ceased in World War I has driven large numbers of Australians to return to the scene of the Gallipoli campaign, to the battlefield itself. Why do so many Australians, even now, travel so far to revisit a conflict that occurred over a century ago?
For quite some time after the Great War, Turkey and Gallipoli were inaccessible because it was mandated League of Nations territory. The old battlefields remained rather mysterious. Pilgrimages by Australians were rare and closely monitored. So after the Second World War, international travel became much more accessible. By the 1960s, Turkey was a stopover on the popular trail from Australia to Europe. Turkish migration to Eastern Australia became common, indeed, reached very great heights by the 1970s. And as Australians began to learn more about modern Turkey and a historical perspective, was part of that.
So when did Australians begin to make the visits to Gallipoli that we are so familiar with today?
Well, the first major pilgrimage to the place came on the 50th anniversary in 1965. There were still veterans around that were fit enough to take that tour in large numbers. As Australians and Turks got to know each other, the anonymous Abdul of the Anzac legend began to have a face and a voice.
Would it be accurate to describe this period from the 1990s as a kind of renaissance for Gallipoli as a pilgrimage site?
In 1990, the 75th anniversary, the Gallipoli campaign inspired celebration as much as commemoration. The trickle of Australian visitors to the battlefields through the 70s and 80s became an absolute flood in 1990. And it inspired the Turks. They built museums and resorts to accommodate and entertain the influx. It was a boom in cultural tourism.
Are other pilgrimage sites important in this equation as well? Should we be talking about destinations other than Gallipoli here?
Look, I think that other destinations grew out of that 75th anniversary on Gallipoli. At that time, remarkably, Australia was able to find 60 veterans aged in their 90s to 103-year-old Jack McCleary DCM who were fit enough to travel. As a consequence, and the enthusiasm for that particular journey, the Commonwealth Government responded by creating a unit that began to take veterans on pilgrimages to old battlefields, the way the Anzac veterans had done in 1965. And the media made much of these pilgrimages. For the Great War centenary period, 2014 to 2018, anniversary events became so popular that attendance had to be ticketed as if it was an international sporting match or music festival.
And you've accompanied many groups to Gallipoli yourself, teaching Australians on site about Australia's involvement in the war.
I think of my work as social history in time of war. I investigate and share stories of Australians whose lives have been touched by war, rather than the usual concept of a military historian who studies the strategy and tactics of conflict. I've been taking people to Australian battlefields at home and overseas since the 1980s. Gallipoli was always a favourite because there were so many veterans of the Great War in our neighbourhood of my youth. You know, one of my earliest trips to Gallipoli was that 75th anniversary trek in 1990 when I accompanied 6 Western Australian veterans, including old Jack McCleary, DCM. It was Jack's 28th birthday on April 25th, 1915, when he led C Company from the 11th Battalion ashore, and we had his 103rd birthday on the same spot. I collected some pebbles from the beach that he landed on. He took half, and the other half I still have in an old shell case ashtray on my mantelpiece. And those pebbles were the inspiration for the battlefield soil samples that are in the floor of the Anzac Memorial.
That's quite a remarkable story. It's also very redolent of the way in which the material settings and objects, hold so much of the memory and express so much of the history.
In the past, my tour groups have ranged from groups of students to open age. I took a group of artists and they produced an exhibition. It was called Your Friend the Enemy. It was wonderful because it was based on letters that one of the artists had preserved from his grandfather, who had served on Gallipoli with the 17th Battalion. It was fascinating to explore a landscape that I thought I knew very well, but to see it through totally different eyes. And I mean, that happens every time you take a new group of visitors to that place.
You've made these trips to Gallipoli many times. Are there specific occasions that stick out in your memory? Well, you've named just one, but I suppose I'm asking for more.
You take something away from every one of them. One of the most interesting tours was in the rather brutal winter of 2015 when I took a group of young Australian community leaders who had been affected by the race riots in Cronulla.
For non-Australian listeners, the Cronulla riots were a series of violent confrontations in the South Sydney suburb of Cronulla in the Sutherland Shire. The riots occurred when on 11th of December 2005, over 5,000 people, mainly young Anglo-Australians, converged on Cronulla Surf Beach, attacking people of so-called Middle Eastern appearance, in their words to, quote, reclaim the beach from outsiders, unquote. The rioters were encouraged by text message and incited by racist right-wing journalists and shock jocks.
Half the group that came with me to Gallipoli were very much of Irish and English ancestry, and they were from Cronulla Surf Lifesaving Clubs, they were local school teachers and so on. The other half were young Australians of Turkish ancestry from suburbs we associate with high migrant communities like Blaxland and Auburn.
With those different kinds of people attending that kind of trip, does it affect any kind of reconciliation? Do you witness people increasing their understanding of other people's experiences?
I think any exposure to information allows people to grow. And so visiting a site that is so loaded with emotion, there's rugged and beautiful landscape, there are cemeteries, it's going to have an impact on people. And when you've given them research tasks so that they go there with some background and some information and they're learning all the time, it's a growing experience and it really has an extraordinary impact on every visitor that's ever been to that site, in my experience.
Do people know in advance what they're going to see when they go to Gallipoli? And do they know the history before they go?
There is no consistency in the reactions of Australian visitors to the site. Some Australians will come with a very clear idea, having read a great deal of fine authorship on the subject. Others will be completely ignorant and open. There are always some who accept the sort of populist stereotypes we've been discussing. I had one member of a tour group who had read nothing but material written by a bandana-wearing writer who, when I finished the tour, challenged me and said, "The way you talk about it, you'd think we'd lost."
So yes, there's the odd challenge for the group leader. What about in a more general sense, the impact of such sites on the people who travel with you? You've mentioned the story of the pebbles and the way that sort of channeled its way into an official memorial, but the impact of the site itself on the people who go.
Reactions to the place are as varied as there are visitors to the peninsula. For a few, the landscape is so mundane that they're unmoved. The beaches are similar to some Australian beaches. The flora is not unusual. But for others, they just become completely absorbed. The ruggedness of the terrain reinforces the impressions of the impossibility of the task that the first Anzacs faced. The natural beauty emphasises the poignancy of the tragic history of the location. A surprising number will reprise those actions of old Jack McCleary DCM and collect a few pebbles or grains of sand. You know, I can only wonder how many get confiscated at customs when they return to Australia. Some will look at the landscape through 21st century eyes and ask why the Anzacs were beaten. Many just visit the cemeteries and comment on doomed heroism.
Is there ever any pushback? By which I mean, do people contest understandings of the meanings of the things they see? Do group members tend to see things broadly in the same way?
Even last October when I was there, I was cornered by a member of the visiting public standing in a cemetery, and he wanted to express his opinion on heroic sacrifice and Australian courage. It was a very, very subjective view, you know, finding a balance and recognising courage and sacrifice on both sides is unfortunately often absent from reflections by the visitors. Often general tourist groups will develop a group mentality, and those that question the myth by suggesting that our soldiers were invaders are frequently shouted down. For Australians today, words like invasion have become so loaded that using them objectively has become problematic.
As Brad notes, the word invasion is a controversial term. Many react to it as a trigger word. Large numbers of Indigenous Australians and their non-Indigenous supporters regard the colonial settlement of this continent as an invasion. On the other hand, many non-Indigenous Australians angrily reject that usage, preferring to turn a blind eye to the devastating effect of European arrivals in Australia from the late 18th century. More recently, right-wing opponents of Asian, and especially Muslim, immigration have baselessly characterised that legal arrival of many peoples from diverse cultures on these shores as an invasion. The word is indeed loaded. How does emphasis on Australian suffering affect people's understanding of the larger significance of the Gallipoli campaign?
I think that perceptions of suffering in and caused by war have changed over the decades. I mean, this may be a sign of increasing maturity. We're at last starting to consider experiences of both ally and former enemy.
That's reassuring to hear. Why do you think it's happening?
Oh, look, I think it's the work of historians. They're certainly helping us to do this. It has only been in the last few decades that digitisation of British and Australian records have made research much easier and more accurate. The biggest challenge has been the research that has gone into tracking down Turkish accounts of the campaign. The Ottoman army on the peninsula, that is the Turks, had a 5% literacy rate, so their written accounts are extremely rare. Those that do exist have only been translated from Old Ottoman into modern Turkish and then into English very, very recently. This happened in detail between 2002 and 2010. Much of it was done by extraordinary historians, largely self-motivated, people like Ken Unchelik from the 18th of March University in Chinakali and the historian and documentary maker Tolga Oranek. By reading, by studying the result of their research, we can reach a much more empathetic understanding. Unfortunately, getting the results of this research into the broader public domain is taking much longer than I had expected.
How do people react when they learn about the Turkish experience?
Exposing people who are embarking on a journey into a realm of cultural tourism to scholarship is really empowering. Many will embrace a totally new perspective, not only on the Gallipoli campaign, but take a broader view of Australia's role in military history.
So what it sounds as if you're suggesting is that people in general and historians are developing a kind of wider angle perspective. They're talking about broader contexts and seeing more historical subtleties in the events that have always fascinated Australians. So it's turning into a different kind of a subject and perhaps a richer one as well. Is that correct?
We are seeing the campaign, indeed we're seeing participants in the campaign and understanding the nuances. We're seeing it for all its complexities, and we're seeing Australia's role in an international perspective where we're writing about Indians that are part of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, where we're appreciating that Australia was part of a much larger multinational force fighting on the peninsula. And we're also seeing Gallipoli in the context of a sideshow of where the war was really being fought. And I think that that's giving Australians a bit of a reality check.
Has this deepening, widening and ever richer appreciation of what happened and the circumstances in which these events occurred, has it affected public commemoration of the Anzacs, do you think?
Yes, I think it has. I think what it's done is allowed people to see themselves, to create a greater empathy with the Anzacs, with the lived experience of those that were on the peninsula. And because the accessibility, particularly for Australians, of detailed records, we can study individual soldiers, we can follow their career paths through training, through their first battles, and in so many cases, tragically, to their deaths.
And it's also easier for citizens, Australian citizens, to do this for themselves, isn't it? There are so many more resources to hand for anybody who's interested. Family research is much easier than it's ever been.
Look, I've just been proofreading a publication for an old colleague in Western Australia who's writing a history of the 11th Battalion. Now, we know there's been at least 3 histories of that battalion, but by looking in detail, in extraordinary detail, at records that previous historians would never have had access to, Wes Olsen has created this remarkable new history of the 11th Battalion, one of the very first units ashore at the landing. He's used Trove, he's used digitised personal correspondence from a state library, as well as the online embarkation records and war diaries from the Australian War Memorials website, and the service dossiers online from the National Archives of Australia website. So as a result, it's a new and detailed retelling of that old story. And in trying to do some proofreading for him, I was really struck by one just little story, little sideshow that reveals just how much more depth we're getting through access to these records. One small and personal Anzac mystery that his research solved was the story of an officer from the 11th Battalion who disappeared in the chaos of the landing, and his remains have never been found. Now, the officer was a German-born immigrant to Victoria. He moved to Western Australia before the war. Gold was a big attractor. And he joined up in August of 1914. He was a brave and popular officer through the training camps and in Egypt. And at the time of the landing, though, he became separated from his men and he stumbled into absolute chaos, scrub, tangled gullies. And so he gets separated from his people and he stumbles into a depression occupied by Western Australians from another battalion. They're frightened and surprised by the newcomer. And fueled with rumours that the enemy had spies in AIF uniforms, they recognised his Western Australian colour patches and with bayonets at his chest demanded to know where he was from. He replied Melbourne in a German accent. When they were expecting to hear Perth or Kalgoorlie, they assumed he must have been an enemy agent with the wrong information. They ran him through and then moved on. Wes knew approximately when and where that officer had disappeared, but it was only chancing upon a digitised letter from a wounded soldier from the other battalion describing how he and his mates had killed what they called a German spy in one of our uniforms. Wes was able to suffice to solve that 110-year-old mystery.
That same accessibility of sources, what effect has it had on what you might term the ownership of the Australian Anzac record or story or myth, whatever you want to call it?
People relate to stories of others. Personal accounts can bridge time and space. This new accessibility is personalising the stories and helps us identify with those whose lives and deaths created the Anzac legend. You look at 102,800 names on a roll of honour and they're just numbers. But when you can look at one person and know that person through the records he's left behind, suddenly those names are all people. When Charles Bean and his team wrote that monumental official history of Australians in the Great War, 1914-18, he concluded with what I consider to be a rather objective and inclusive statement. He wrote, "What these men did, nothing can alter now. The good and the bad, the greatness and the smallness of their story will stand. Whatever of glory it contains, nothing now can lessen. It rises, as it will always rise, above the mists of ages, a monument to great-hearted men, and for their nation a possession forever." I mean, if we disregard the anachronistic language, we can see that he recognises faults and flaws. But despite that, there are lessons to be learned and values to be admired and treasured.
I have to say, Brad, that I don't think the Anzac tradition, with all of its complexities, with all of the different ways that people approach the stories and react to them, I don't think that they could have a better mediator nor a better custodian than you, who I think must know the detail and the nuance of this subject as well, if not better, than anyone else I can think of. Thank you so much for talking to us on Making Sense of History.
A privilege on my account, Nick. Thank you very much indeed.
We acknowledge the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the lands on which this episode of Making Sense of History was recorded. The podcast was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities.